thanks everyone for staying. This is the last session, I believe, or close to the end, which is always so. Thanks for being here and having your stamina. So we'll just start with having the panelists introduce themselves and say a little bit about their background. Go ahead, Igor.
Sure. So I'm Igor Bratislava. Nice to meet everyone. Currently, I'm doing data analytics at Meta, working with primarily recruiting data. And prior to that, my background has pretty much been mostly in consulting. So I've done a lot of work doing data analytics implementations. So a lot of my bread and butter is building scalable analytics systems. So coming into the client, understanding, doing a discovery, wireframing, doing all the data integration ETL work, also doing dashboard development and reporting. So just everything from the entire data analytics lifecycle. So I've had experience working in all sorts of industries, a lot in healthcare, marketing, life sciences, pharma. So happy to be here.
Hey everyone, my name's G. And I started my career off at Techstars, working as an associate there. After Techstars, I've built and sold 2 companies, then did angel invested about 10 companies so far in my young angel investing career. Now starting my 3rd company, Pocket Founder, which is to help founders build pitch decks, which is something that I'm sure everyone needs help on. So I'm happy to be able to help in that realm. Thank you.
I'm another G. My name is Glenda. I'm the CEO and founder of Autism Health, which we just launched last week. I hate to use the word disrupting the autism healthcare industry, and truly help a lot of people. I'm also the ambassador for Women in AI for the state of Massachusetts. I also lead the CTI Data Women in Data and AI group, and volunteers in a number of organizations. I also serve as a principal consultant for CTI Data. I'm a number person at heart. I grew up a statistician, and I always say I'm a natural data scientist and everything. But I'm truly about building solutions that make a difference, and truly about the experience that it delivers to people. So really happy to be a part of the panel today, and nice to meet you, everyone.
Awesome. So yeah, Glenda, why don't you kick off, so talking about how your company uses big data.
Yeah.
We'll just go along the line.
Cool. Autism Health is truly about AI and big data. We are using terabytes of data from proprietary databases, tons and tons of website scraping, lots of data quality algorithms, because the quality of the data is very important to us. And me, having been a member of Women in AI, responsibility, ethics, bias are very important to me. And the center of the solution is really the special needs community that is very near and close to my heart. So quality is really important to us. So that's big data. Having said that, right, big data, in order for it to sing, in order for it to connect with people, you got to apply AI, right? So those 2 to me are twins. And the outcome of that is really delivering information at the speed of light, right? Really under a minute, right? At the at everyone's fingertips. Truly automating probably a days and months of experience, so probably a minutes, right? So think of that experience. So there's no other option other than do big data or AI technologies to truly bring that, create that experience. So that's how we're using it.
Awesome.
Yeah, so my current company does not use big data. I know. Oh no. Not every company needs it. But for my first company, we worked with police and fire departments to equip them with off-the-shelf drone systems. So we were using that for mostly search and rescue. Obviously, there's a lot of big data implications there. Our things are around search and rescue, so a lot of pulling data from FLIR-based sensors, right, and being able to do analysis on that. And when you're talking about in austere environments, right, this is stuff that's, out in the wilderness. You don't have connectivity to cloud, so this is a lot of edge compute that our first company did. So that's kind of where big data kind of went there, and thinking about how to do big data, but on the edge.
Nice. So I'm at Meta. Obviously, probably all of you know Facebook, Meta, very large company. So we get lots and lots of data. I don't work on the app side, right? The amount of data probably on the app side is just like crazy, right? Because people are on sending messages on WhatsApp, Facebook, like all those apps. But I'm on the recruiting side, right? So we still have everyone wants a job at Meta, right? Students want a job at Meta. You know, people do a lot of referrals at Meta, like a lot of online applications. So there's a huge volume of data coming in. I personally was responsible. I analyzed the referrals data, which was very interesting. So one of the things that we'd have to look at is, the capacity, right? So how many referrals do we have coming in, right? Like, we have a lull, is there a spike, and do we have enough capacity? Do we have enough people to actually process those referrals and move them through the process? Another example is we looked at unstructured data. So one of the V's of big data is like variety. So it comes in different forms, not just like, data that naturally belongs in spreadsheets. So we would send out surveys to employees who would, do a referral, and we essentially that generated a bunch of text data, right? So we had high volume. We'd systematically go through it, try to identify what the themes were. Did people understand like how to refer someone? Did they understand like, which buttons to click, how to get help, like those types of things. So that's another example. We constantly looked at the funnel, so the recruiting funnel. So, each stage in the process, like what are the pass-through rates, and in order to achieve our hiring targets, how many do we need at the top, given all like the percentage and pass-through rates, right, to get to our targets. So those are some examples of big data.
Awesome. So that's 3 pretty different answers. I thought I would ask the audience also to raise your hand. I wanted to get a sense of, where does your organization need to make better data-driven decisions? So think about your organization and where you're at, and where that you could bring data to bear, where you think would be really high. So I wanted to ask, so raise a hand if for the product itself uses big data, or maybe it is big data, or at least the product design decisions would be somewhere where you think your organization could do better. Or please raise your hand if you think it's a product. There's a product play for data in your organizations. Okay, not a lot of people. What about lead generation? So now we're some sales, like in the sales space, could big data be brought to bear? Okay, awesome. And then what about like recruiting and engineering, or HR, if it's a bigger company? Yeah, a couple people there. Any places where people think that data, they want where, presumably you're here because you want to use big data in some way, or you think it's interesting. So what have I missed? What are the other places that people want to use big data? So we have a sense of what you're trying to do with the data.
I'm interested in the like acquisition of the data. So someone mentioned like web scraping to like pull information off, using like a service to do that, versus designing something to do yourself, versus asking ChatGPT to do it for you. Like kind of what the different approaches are for kind of getting started and starting to put together a large database in today's day.
Yeah, we'll get to a little bit what that'll look like, and if we don't, we can talk to it about at the end. Yeah. Okay. Well, I don't want to belabor. I just thought I would try to quickly get a sense. So one of the questions we also had is, what industries do you think will be most disrupted by big data in the next 5 years? So that's sort of looking into the future. What's going to be disrupted? And Glenda, do you want to take a stab at that?
Sure. Having been in the middle of COVID-19, while working for the state of Massachusetts, the governor and the chief procurement officer of the state, I think I learned and discovered that there were so many blind spots and opportunities in healthcare. And I know that, we went through a phase where probably there was some slowing down of some financial funding with tons and tons of use cases, but it's now coming up again. So I do believe that health or healthcare is going to be really disrupted by AI. And that's number one for me. Second will always be either financial or media content and identity management. So
Yeah.
so those are like the always, but top of the list for me is healthcare. So
Any other panelists?
Yeah. I was
Yeah.
going to say healthcare is the one that comes to mind for me. Like healthcare traditionally is like way behind in technology, right? And there's huge opportunity in healthcare. Like sure, that's something we can all relate to when you go to the doctor, your electronic medical record, for example, the Epic is a really big player in that, right? So there's a lot of data around that to do predictions, right? To be proactive about your healthcare, right? Looking at kind of your personal record, but also kind of like population-based data, understanding like readmission risk, like who's likely to develop diabetes, who's likely to get readmitted to the hospital within like X number of days. All these models are being like developed in healthcare to try to be proactive in terms of care. Also from an insurance company perspective, kind of limit the cost, right? Also, there's a lot of just from an imaging perspective, when we get X-rays or MRIs and other types of stuff, that's data, right? So every time there's an image, right, like we're building that database. Certain images translate to certain conditions. So this is kind of, it's not meant to replace doctors, but it's kind of decision support, right? So like it's just another data point, and that's another important point, is that big data is not meant to replace like physicians. It's really meant for decision support. It's meant for augmentation. So I think in healthcare there's just a ton of potential. So I'm excited to see kind of how AI and big data kind of evolve in that space.
Yeah. Maybe I'll take a different approach to the question.
Yeah, please.
So when I look at data, right, and sometimes evaluating a company or thinking about like ideating a company idea, right? When I think about data, it kind of falls into two buckets. It's either the main course or it's a side dish, right? And so, is it the thing that fundamentally is needed to perform the activities of your company, or is it something that's produced as a byproduct, right? Is it the sawdust in your business, and maybe you can reapply that? Sawdust eventually becomes insulation, right? So that's reusing something that you just happen to collect overall. And or is it the main thing? Like, hey, we as a business provide value through the use of collecting data or leveraging existing data in order to do something. So when you think about it in those two ways, right? One is from the start, and then the other is in support of a larger organization. So when we look at like industry wide, right? A lot of companies, big companies, and when we're talking about disrupting companies, you're looking for that sawdust, right? That you can repurpose and use in a different avenue. So when we make that evaluation, you can look at like, hey, yes, healthcare creates a lot of data and you can utilize that, right? There's always some way to be able to utilize it. It's just that it needs to be able to drive value, right? In other organizations, they can receive data. Fintech is notorious, right, within the finance industry. So we always look at those different types of things. And one that might be a little bit underrated when you look at main course, side dish, that type of stuff is, the hungry areas, right? The areas that are not currently collecting data, though they could be benefited by that. So, just thinking about like off the top of my head, right? Under technology has not touched a particular sector. Obviously, those are areas where you think about two phases, right? The collection of data and then being able to utilize that data in order to do cool and interesting things with that. Ultimately, in the service of driving revenue, driving some form of tangible value, so on and so forth. So
Yeah, no, that's great. I don't know how many people know Gong from sales in the sales space. I think of that as an example where sales, there were all these phone calls, tons of phone calls, and once speech recognition got to a place where they could take those phone calls, which is data, and turn it into something useful. Now the Gong app allows you to search for keywords, and then I'll say like, okay, these are all the conversations where a sale was made, and here's all the conversations where the sale wasn't made, or the lead went on to the next stage, and then be able to look at. You could do keyword spotting. There's all kinds of stuff you can do once you are able to gather that sawdust. Which is, that's the point of sales, is not to have these conversations, it's to sell things, but you have this data coming off the side. It's a little bit on what you're talking about. Awesome. Yeah. So one thing, the next question we were thinking of talking about was, okay, so you got big data and you got AI, and everyone, and they're sort of merged and they're sort of not. What is the interaction between those two? And I don't know, let Igor start just so they can go and everyone will get a chance.
Yeah.
You're not gonna steal my line.
I mean, I think, we're in a big data panel, right? So, like the interaction between big data and AI, it's very direct, but at the same time, like you don't necessarily need AI or even like big data to have value, to drive value in your business, right? Especially if you're a startup or like smaller to medium sized company, like you don't I mean, if you can collect all the data and more data is better, right? Like you can start to analyze more. But even if you just work with what you have, right? You can still make significant headway in business decisions. You don't have to collect everything in the world and integrate everything in the world. Even just simplicity goes a long way. Even when you talk about like AI and ML, there's all these fancy algorithms, but in many cases, just like a simple linear regression can do, right? Like there's no need to kind of over-engineer things. Now, that being said, when you collect a bunch of data, you're able to see patterns that you otherwise wouldn't be able to see, right? Like you have a large data set, right? So this AI and ML can start to kind of notice patterns that that wouldn't be like visible with just smaller amounts of data. Yeah, so I think they're very definitely tightly connected, but I would just caution that like not everything has to be like ML and AI, and not everything has to be like so fancy. Like I think we're here because we're interested in this, but there is like a lot of power in simplicity, and I would just say don't forget that.
Yeah. So maybe I'll take this in kind of the investor direction. So, we are here at like Startup Week. So when we're evaluating startups, everyone loves throwing in the buzzwords, right? And I would posit that as long as you know how you're piloting your business, you can put those buzzwords in, so long as it is used to your advantage for particular reasons. Ultimately, for your business, it is to generate revenue, value for customers, and produce long sustainable growth traction, right? If it's VC, it's exponential. For angel investment, bootstrapping, grow at your own pace, right? When we look at big data and AI from that perspective, we look at is this actually needed, right? If I stripped out all those buzzwords, does it actually make sense? In some cases, yes, it's absolutely vital to the main thing, right? If you're a weather analysis, software as a service, you require that, right? There's no fancy way to do those types of things, right? Without being able to use linear regression, classification, all these different ML techniques, right? With big data in mind, right? Big data might be an enabler for those types of things. And so as a base, it works in certain industries or certain types of customer bases than others, right? If you are a B2B company, big data comes a lot more easy. B2C, well, most consumers don't have big data sets, right, that you can comb through. It's harder. You have to collect it, right? And so maybe from a B2C sense, you're looking more at like sawdust and the generation of sawdust as a byproduct of a different business model, right? Which can drive a secondary business model, which can accelerate growth in some particular way, right? B2B companies, they probably have a data warehouse somewhere, and you can dumpster dive and find whatever you need and create tremendous value that way, right? So, just looking at like the interplay between AI and, big data, it's down to the fundamentals, right? Driving value for customers. Does it make sense for your business model? If I strip away all of the AI big data words, can your business work? If it does, then don't put more stuff than it needs to be in there, right? But if it's absolutely required or it drives better value than without, then absolutely go ahead and use it, right? And it gets you more attention if it works.
Awesome. Thank you. Glenda?
Yeah, I do
Yeah.
agree, right? So I think you have to kind of understand your problem first, whether you're going to activate big data or not. Is it a small data problem, right? Is it a big data problem? I think you have to go through the qualifiers so you can say, yeah, this is a big data problem, so therefore I'm going to use big data concepts and big data technology. So as a businesswoman and also being surrounded by so many advisors, right? I would say to you that if I were to develop and I've developed an evaluation model, I don't need big data, right? A lot of that is common sense, maybe some linear regression or financial modeling that you could just do the valuation, right? And there's so many science and methodologies around that. The second piece of that is the audience, trying to quantify the addressable audience, right? Now, you can use big data technologies to get that if you want to really get fancy, but you can just do simple random sampling or some existing white papers to truly derive some small, I'm gonna call it small data, right?
Right.
Instead of big data. So it could be a hybrid. It could be one of them. So where am I headed with this statement, right? So I always say, from a product innovation perspective and for the problem that I'm trying to solve, right? My problem for my startup is a big data problem, right? It's getting all this data sets, right, that are typically crowdsourced by, I call it underground parent and caregiver information, mixing that with proprietary databases, mixing that with web scraping, right? So that is my problem, and getting it to at your fingertips on a mobile device, right? And oh, by the way, we've designed an experience which is very, very fast, right? So there's no other way to do it other than big data. So, and that's how I validated my solution, and that's how I articulated my problem. So if the problem is a big data problem, then go with big data. But if it can be accomplished through what I call small data, then go with small data. And oh, by the way, it's an AI problem, because the technology to deliver that very, very efficient and short experience and good outcome and experience, and it's kind of ambitious. So you got to use AI. So that's
Awesome.
so to me, big data for my specific use case and for my specific problem are twins. Big data and AI are twins. So
So let's stick with Glenda and think about, so you got startups, you got big companies, you've worked at both, you've got Meta, and they have tons of data, and other companies like Honeywell that I've worked at also have tons of data, and they have problems. They can't always do things with that data that a small company could, and vice versa. The small company sometimes starts with no data in some ways. So what are some advantages and disadvantages, since this is a startup conference workshop, that a startup has? What are some advantages and some disadvantages that a startup has with respect to data? Just make it more general.
So the way I would answer that question, right? Every solution that we build is all about people. So the advantage, and I think it's a superpower of startups, is they can be agile, they can be nimble, right? They can do iterations on the fly, and their go-to-market strategy is probably faster. So their speed from ideation all the way to value, right, is much faster. Like, I don't know, a large hospital in the healthcare, or the IBMs of the world, because they have ginormous processes in place that they have to go through. And oh, by the way, their tech stack is so wide and high that it's almost sometimes it's like a Frankenstein, and how do you move, right? Whereas when you're a startup, right, you already know the technology, and oh, by the way, it uses 2023 technologies versus I don't know, probably some pre-existing technology that predates you. So how do you mix all of that to deliver an innovative solution in a big setting? So to me, that's a superpower for a startup. As long as you have the vision, you're value focused, you're outcome focused, you know your market, right? You have a clear go-to-market strategy, and you have a very, very solid foundation in terms of valuation, and you have a great team. So and that you can form, right, pretty quickly versus probably a big company. So
I can also just speak to some of the challenges of the big company. Like everything is just complex. Like it's just that's the only word that I can come up with is, I mean, with a startup, right? Like you kind of have more control over things. You can do things faster, more agile. Like you probably know what you've done. Oftentimes in like big companies, you come in and like there might not be like documentation, right? And so you're working with data that, you know, someone 5 years ago applied some business logic that, you know, you don't really understand, that no one understands. And, you know, then you're trying to go through like the scripts, and all these scripts have like a million dependencies, and even the data engineers, you know, like don't even know, right? So like there's so much complexity to try to just sometimes even understand your data, right? There's a lot of, you know, when I came to Meta, I kind of thought that, you know, oh, like, you know, this big company is going to have everything, kind of everything's going to be perfect. And, you know, they have dedicated data engineers and all this stuff. And, you know, sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. But basically, you know, Meta suffers from the same problems that every other company does. But, you know, when things are bigger, it definitely presents more challenges, and there's lots of complexities, which, you know, sometimes can be really frustrating. And, you know, everything has its pros and cons, right? Like, you know, Meta, we have more data, right? But, you know, things are more complex, right? Startups, we might have like less data, but, you know, things are a little bit easier and like agile to innovate, right? So everything always has trade-offs. It's not like one is necessarily better than the other.
If you want.
From I guess I'll look at it from a startup lens, right? First, just got to think about like, you know, when you're a startup, you're coming in, the most likely thing is you're doing your customer interviews, you're doing your diligence, right? You go up to a big company and you're like, hey, your data over here, we'd love to use it. We can help you lower cost or blah, blah, blah. And the person's like, I have a million things to do at work. Why do I can't care about this, right? You have to think about from a startup perspective, from that, like that's a good tell on product market fit, right? When something rises enough interest to the level that someone who's super busy in a position to be able to provide you that data actually cares, right? That's a really good positive signal in one sense. Now, there are other problems, right? Because the first time you mess up in some particular way, right, that access can get turned off, or they lose your email, right? They send you to spam, you're done, right? It's a very perilous road in the B2B space for the startup perspective. Looking at it from a corporate perspective, right? That's why CVCs have been popping up, corporate venture capital, not just to gain the upside of potentially investing in, you know, potential competition down the line, or in, you know, new innovative technologies to supplant R&D research. There are ways in order to invest into companies, right, that you can allow someone to use your data set and you can nurture that company in a kind of incubator like fashion, right, and then drive long-term growth at a larger company, right? In that way, your CVC works as kind of quote unquote babysitter to make sure that these fledgling company doesn't make those mistakes, right? And, you know, allays the risk. So that's probably like a halfway measure. Not a lot of companies are really built to be able to handle that. In some cases, you know, it's risk aversion, right, at the max. And a company that might be hyper competitive, you know, the knives come out, right, for each other and different types of stuff that goes on within a company culture, right? It's something that you make in an evaluation when you reach out to a company in the B2B space. And so just kind of thinking about that interplay, right? You're a startup, you're agile, you're great, but you're going to make mistakes, right? Is that within the risk profile of a large corporate to be able to tolerate that, right? And in some cases, that's super crazy. But it's also risk tolerances to your own business, because I've mentored a company where the dreaded intern deletes the database has happened before, right? And if you're the startup and you're like, oh, my API call says there's no database anymore. What happened? Oh, well, we let our intern touch some stuff and, oops. So, oh, great. We were like
Wow.
driving, potentially like hundreds of $1,000s in revenue, and now it's gone. So great, right?
Wow.
So like when you think about it in that way, right? There's risks in multiple different directions, right? And there's not really much recourse there, right? So when you look at it from that measure, it's just a part of the business, right? It's just a risk and something that you have to be aware of.
Yeah, I'll just add that I was at a large company that remain unnamed, and I wanted to get customer support questions, and I knew the person that had the data. I knew the kind of access that I wanted. I knew the data technology. 6 months minimum, and I had to go through 3 different trainings. And even after I got through all these trainings, then I got sort of the end of the line and waited until I got access. And that's a typical kind of big company. And some of it's to make sure that no one deletes. Some of it's to make sure that you don't put some piece of data out on social media somehow or in some place that's easy to get at, and then the company gets a black eye. So yeah, it's
gosh, and I think
nice,
to just add to that, like in some cases you might just think about like maybe it's if you wanted to work with a company, they're like, I'm not really feeling it, but you saw that the interest was there. It was just a risk aversion thing. Maybe even consider competing against the corporate in their space, right? Just to be able to drive the data in order to do that type of stuff, right? It's just like, if you have that much conviction in it, right? Sometimes you got to go and get it, right? And so, you could get it straight from the source, or you create a source, right? And so it's just part of the business.
Awesome. I want to switch gears a little bit to actually address the question sort of like more level than the how. So how things like tech stack, skills that you need, people skills that what kind of people do you need, costs, what kind of costs are there, what kind of hurdles. So I guess we could actually start with the tech stack, and that's what I think you were asking about. What are some thoughts on where to start in picking a tech stack as a startup?
Want to start, Glenda?
Yeah, sure. So I can tell you that my experience, we started with lots of web scraping, and it's a number of technologies that we use to get to. We use Hugging Face, some libraries in there that are totally open source, and then we also use ChatGPT 4. And then for the mature databases that we had that are more stable, obviously SQL and Python, right? And then we magically just mixed everything together through Python, really. That's what we did in terms of a tech stack. The bigger challenge for me really is the UX, right? I don't know. And then I don't want to kind of put a lower value on data, but I think we've figured out the data pretty well. It's the UX side of it, right? Which is both AI and very, very, you can only AI so much of UX, right? That's a larger discussion. Maybe we should have a different class in UX because we're so focused on really delivering a seamless experience. We use some AI technologies like, what do we use? We have Webflow because they use a lot of I/O. We also have Figma, right? And they're AIing a lot of stuff in Figma. They're really developing a lot of UX and some proprietary codes as well. So it's a mixture of everything. For my specific use cases now, in terms of data acquisition, what was it? Your question was on leads, right? Was it on leads or data acquisition?
Yeah, just like gathering data from that's out there.
I mean, there's a lot of like public data sets, right? How would I go to data.world, I go to Kaggle, I go to, I mean, there's LinkedIn, right? Always LinkedIn if you're a, so that's another data sets. And lots of public forums through Reddit that I went through, and just to kind of look for my specific use cases, underground autism data sets. So, and some proprietary data sets. So I don't know if that explains the tech stacks, but
I'll add to it. In the right traditional architecture, you have your transactional system, right? That's capturing the data, right? And then you might have some like, ETL tool that's kind of transforming the data and then landing it in a database, right? That's like the whole ETL process. But now from like a tech stack perspective, to be more like agile and like be able to work with data faster, more streamlined approach, like oftentimes that like middle layer, the ETL tool is getting removed. So I don't know if anyone's familiar with like the acronym ELT, where it's like you're taking the data straight from the transactional system. And one of the really big common technologies that's being used is Snowflake. Anyone heard of Snowflake? So it's a very popular cloud data warehouse. It's very fast. Lots and lots of companies are moving to Snowflake. And in the past, I'd helped companies with like develop a modern data architecture actually to support, this type of data processing. They're also moving, batch processing is still a thing, like typical like data warehouses, but other companies are also moving towards like real-time solutions like Kafka. So like with batch processing, you have to update a bunch of like records at once, right? If there's like a delay, then there's a bunch of dependencies, right? So it can create data processing problems. But if you, process your data if you ingest your data with something like Kafka, right, then you're essentially like ingesting the data and processing it at the same time, which means like, your system is going to be more efficient and you're going to have less dependencies, less delays. So I have seen companies moving to this hybrid approach of, still not saying batch processing is like terrible. Batch processing has its place, but kind of a combination of like batch processing plus, like something like Kafka or like like streaming for certain use cases where things need to be kind of updated immediately. I have seen companies where it's just like everything is just all this like batch processing, and it creates so many problems, and it's not a very modern approach. So, those are some of the things that come to mind with the tech stack.
Yeah, maybe I love talking about infrastructure. It's
Yeah.
like a weird thing. So like thinking about cloud, right? So when we talk about cloud, you got the Snowflake, but that's also, you go back to the base level of cloud, right? You have the AWS, Amazon, you have Azure and Google Cloud, uh, in my opinion. But like personally, I've been more advocating to think about like, unless the data is like literally in the cloud, to think about when we're talking about sensor data or, and maybe it's because I have a little bit more bias towards hardware and like in the field, if you will, type thing. So like if you're looking at like ag tech and that type of stuff, I try to push as much stuff away from the cloud and more towards like edge compute stuff, right? And so we're looking at like being able to compute as much as possible on Raspberry Pis. How much can you extract in there? Then you don't need data warehousing because all you're doing is just doing processing at the edge, right? However much you need to connect, great. You're transmitting, great. But like, it's a really like just think about the expense, right, of storage and the all that type of stuff, right? And so when you look at that, the more you can process without having an S3 bucket as the intermediary, right? You're saving costs there. The more you're able to do that, because you're just paying the one-time down cost of a Raspberry Pi, maybe a tiny solar panel that goes along with it, right? Like those are some of the solutions that like I don't see a lot of people doing. They're like, oh, I'm gonna try to stick a Starlink out on some poor farmer's, place just so that I can stream it over to cloud. And I'm like, I don't know if that's we're not thinking enough here, right? So like, I'm gonna take this time to like advocate more like to the edge as close as possible to someone's things. So when we think about like, cloud, right? If someone's ingesting something on cloud, right? Well, maybe it doesn't really work that much on Meta for like literally doing things as close as possible to the app place. So it might not work there, but like being able to work within, cloud infrastructure and that type of stuff, whatever is closest as possible without the need to do data transport, especially when we're talking about big data loads, right? That moving it from your S3 bucket to my S3 bucket to process does not make sense. So the more that you're able to push it as close as possible,
Yeah.
right, without
I
transport.
kind of like what he's saying too, because also I think a lot of data scientists would like it too. I've worked with people in the past where they often don't like working with like data that's been processed so much. You know why? Because every time you process data, it changes. It goes through like this layer and that layer and that layer, and then it's like finally you're looking at the data and you're like, what is this, right? You're like, what's been done to the data? At that point, like a bunch of people could have applied some logic, or you don't know, there could be like errors introduced in the data. So oftentimes data scientists like to work with these like really raw data sets, kind of things that are closest to the source, right? Because they haven't been like corrupted, or like, I mean, sometimes you need to transform your data and apply some business logic, but there is definitely something to be said of just kind of using the data that's very close to the source. So I kind of like that.
Yeah, and to your point, you were asking about like scraping, right? And think about the scraping, right? Do you do it in two distinct steps: collection, processing, or process at the point of source,
Yeah.
right? Why are you going to use the collected data? Does it feel good to have like hard drives, external hard drives of stuff? Like, just don't like that changes the notion of scraping, right? It's no longer a scraping; it's a analysis, right? So it's, let's just say like I'm scraping a website, right? And it's like pulling out key points of data. You take the data in place, transform it, do whatever processing you were going to do instead of collect, process, or whatever, And so that's just kind of a paradigm shift in that. I mean, in some cases, it's not confident engineering, right? Not confident programming, where you're like, I'd like another pass at this data, right? But like, okay, just go. If you were able to escape one time, go do it again. Maybe the website changed for whatever reason. It's negligible, really, unless it's like in a super fast like finance, like your stock prices or something crazy like that. But like for the most case, like most things are static. So like you process on the edge, you do it right the first time, ideally. If it's not, then maybe that's more of an engineering problem than a different thing. But like, just think about that, right? Like when you're a startup, certain amount of resources. I, as an investor, really don't like to pay for S3. Like I look at the S3 bills sometimes, I'm like, oh my gosh, stick that in the glacial storage, please. Like, like you're not using it. Why is this here? And we're wasting money when like you were asking, you're like, oh, can I raise more to like do marketing? Okay, well, like. So yeah.
Awesome. No, good stuff. I mean, I work for Analog Devices, and we do a lot on the edge. So
Right.
that's
Awesome.
that's exactly what everybody wants to hear at the place I work, because they want the computing to happen at the edge. I will say, if you're going to do things in the cloud, and first of all, doing things on the edge, so I work with a lot of the folks that try to get the algorithms to work on the edge. You don't have a lot to work with there. So you're not using, a GPU, or, well, you don't have. Go ahead. Sorry.
So like interesting things that you're saying about that, right? Like, because with Analog Devices, right? You're talking about like embedded devices or different things, and I'm nerding out about this, right? So like you got like Raspberry Pis, right? So you think about the processing power of Raspberry Pi. It's comparable to a typical computer, but if you're doing like data analytics and generation, that type of stuff, they're actually NVIDIA's released a product, right? And other Microsoft also has one. So I'm not like advocating for a particular brand, but there are edge compute GPUs that are being created, and they're getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And I'm more and more impressed about that. I think that's the direction that we're going in. And when you think about like having a first or second generation like NVIDIA graphics card basically in a small tiny form factor, like sure, maybe it won't run Crisis, but like it'll run whatever AI thing that you need, right? So when you look at it from that perspective, you're like, great, right? And that's how like that's where the industry is pushing. I'm loving it. And, to this point for startups, I'm not telling you to run your, on-prem, stuff, but that's kind of the same mindset, right? The more edge compute, that type of stuff that you can do.
The only thing I would add is if you're going to go to the cloud and you're going to use Airflow or you're going to use MongoDB, I find that the trade-off between running it yourself, like spinning up a server and then running it on that server and running it yourself, it's cheaper and you have more flexibility, it seems. But I think it's much better to do on a managed service. So MongoDB, I just happen to have a friend that works there. I don't have any investments. They have a managed service. I think it's called Atlas that allows you they'll do everything for you. And Airflow is same way. There's managed versions of that and all the cloud and Kafka and all these things. You can so look into running the managed version. Don't think, oh, I'll spin this up myself. I mean, you can, but it costs a lot of engineering time. And I think actually the trade-off is worth it, unless there's some reason why your version, your application needs to have it be special in some way, not what the cloud companies are providing. Awesome. Let's see. What about people? So if you're going to hire somebody, let's say you're a startup and you need to be doing other things, like maybe you're the expert. Okay, great. But if you're not, or if you need to be doing other things, what are the skills? What are you looking for? What do you need to? Who's your first hire, your second hire, your third hire, if you want to get in this space? Yeah, why don't you start in the middle, George? Right.
Yeah. That's a good question. So let's start small first, from a startup perspective, right? So you need the head of the chip, the CEO, the CTO to build the holistic product, right? When we look at it from that perspective, right? When you're, and I guess focusing on specifically the engineering team, right? When you think about hiring for the engineering team, you look at the CTO and you see what their strong suits are. Is it overall product leadership, or is it on, the bare metal guts and bolts, right? There are different types of CTOs. I'm sure we all know those types of people, right, who are going to be in those positions. If the person is not as strong and let's focus on, and since our focus is on big data, right, on data analytics and that type of thing, you might think about pulling in a VP of engineering to work under the CTO. The CTO provides overall product directioning from a technical perspective. The VP of engineering goes out and builds out a full, engineering, data analytics, ML ops organization, right? When we look at it from that perspective, if your CTO is very in the weeds, not saying to, promote someone higher, right? But you're going to need that big vision person, right? So this is when you're playing, musical chairs with titles and stuff. You'd create a chief product officer role to do product leadership, right? And that's when, you essentially have, someone who might ostensibly be over your CTO in terms of like product directioning and management from that perspective. But that's not their strong point, right? And so that's how you kind of play that musical chairs. So hopefully that answered that.
Yeah.
From that perspective.
Well, I'm asking for the impossible. I'm kidding. I mean, I typically like to hire ambiverts, right? They're both business savvy people, centered and really, really high technical. Have a strategic mindset, but really ready to just bring it down to earth and roll up their sleeves quickly. So that's like the number one hire. I do like, my second hire would be very, very product focused, outcome driven. Knows how to truly articulate the market and the opportunity from a data driven way. And then number three would be really, really high functioning CTO. So down in the weeds kind of CTO. So those for my specific stage and for my specific use case at this moment, I think that would be my answer. So
I do I do like the
This is the recruiter here, right? So
Yeah, yeah.
he's the guy to listen to.
no, I agree with I think when you're small, like the multiple ambivert approach, like find someone that has enough technological expertise, but also kind of has some of that business savvy, right? So I think that makes sense, to start. But then as you get bigger, right, you need to scale. You obviously want to have someone with that deeper technical expertise that can build out the platform that's scalable and that will work for the future. So I think there's probably a natural evolution where you kind of need someone who has like both kind of the tech and the biz component like initially, right? And then, all right, we need to scale. All right, well, let's hire some, engineering expertise or the VP of engineering, something like that, right? And obviously, all of this is you need to always keep the business in mind. Everything is about the business, right? You're not just building the technology just for fun because it's cool, right? You're building it because you're trying to add value, sell the product. So it's important to have those product focused people as well, and people who really understand like the market, the opportunity, the analytics. So I think that's how I would approach it.
Awesome. Thank you. We're running short on time, so I wanted to turn it over to the audience and see questions people have.
So this might surprise you that I'm involved with an alfalfa ranch that's connected to the world via Starlink. And I'm just curious, like, I was intrigued by your Raspberry Pi comments. And are they really capable of doing the types of things that you were suggesting?
Well, so it depends on what
No,
you're.
I was lying.
The Raspberry Pi is as useful as an actual Raspberry Pi sitting out there. No, so like when you think about Raspberry Pis, they've come a long way. So like if you had the Nano or the Zero or the 2, maybe 3A, those were not very powerful. It was like 2 gigabytes, I believe, 2 to 4 gigabytes of RAM, right? Nowadays they're going into 4, 8, 16, gigabytes of RAM, storage. They have USB buses for external hard drives, that type of stuff. But when you think about like their compute, they've gotten a lot stronger. They have Wi-Fi buses and or Wi-Fi connectivity and those types of things to be able to connect you to the web if needed. But like it depends on your particular use case, right? If it's always like it's like being an Apollo project member, right? You have a certain amount of resources to use, right? So you build your applications a particular way. Alfalfa farm, you're maybe it's like security cameras, that's your use case, and being able to do some form of intruder analysis of wild animals, for example, right? Or fence maintenance, right, which would be conducted through CV, right? You would analyze like your load. Is it able to do it? You might space out when you do your compute so that you can make use of the amount of RAM that you have available. Or if your farm happens to have Starlink, right, send it to the cloud, right? And maybe you don't have to worry about that, right? It's just about the resources that you have, right? If you want to run as lean as possible, as most startups do, because it just runs towards your margin, right? You're doing things repeatedly, right? And you're thinking about scaling, right? So the least amount of you're just lowering your expenses, right? And there are just kind of rules of thumbs that you can adopt as an engineering organization and as a company writ large, that you can limit the expenses in which you're doing those type of things. No problem. Do you need on your farm? Yeah.
Anyone else? Questions? Thank you.
Hi, so I do data science and data programming now, but in the past I've done more classic engineering, like Linux kernel stuff. One thing I've noticed in older projects, if a person goes away from the project, it's a lot easier to maintain. Somebody comes in, they just understand the code more easily. Whereas with data science, sometimes a person builds the infrastructure, they leave, and nobody understands how it's done. A new person comes in, they just have to refactor the thing to make it in the way that they understand it. So what's your thinking about portability of code for data infrastructure?
For data infrastructure or for data science?
For data infrastructure, for pipelines, for databases, for batch operations.
My God, that's a hard. I don't know how to answer that. Anyone?
I mean, I think there were two things I heard from there, right? So somebody built the infrastructure and they left, and there's no documentation, and you're just expected to maintain and keep this thing running, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the simple solution is to have documentation, but you know,
No, it's no, I think it's really hard. And Meta. So I worked at Meta. That's I know Igor from Meta, and I worked in the data. And to your point, I mean, they had things like, for example, they had you could just look at you could search for data tables, and all the tables had documentation, but it was very easy to get at. And so, and then you could search against it, and you could find, oh, look, there's this table that has that kind of data in that column. So there is no silver bullet, but it is. I do think you're right that it's not the same place that code is at, and just people haven't worked on it and haven't come up with. There used to be Java Doc, if you remember that. That was a push forward, and people got better at putting some information right in the function. And it became common, like, okay, you always put in a Python, you always put a little bit of documentation in there. And I feel like that just hasn't happened in the data science space. And so you're absolutely right. As soon as and that's what you were getting at, that you come into a big company and your first thing is, what the heck are all these fields? Now I did use, there's something called, there's basically, let's see, I think it's called, there's like a pandas AI type thing where you can actually ask it, label these columns. Here's a CSV file, label the columns for me. Give them better labels than what they have. And it does surprisingly well.
Yeah, there are a lot of AI technologies.
Exactly. So there's some hope. I have some hope that actually some of the AI technologies can help with this problem.
So actually,
yeah.
Not to plug Informatica, but Informatica has done this, like it automatically assigns English names in a lot of the columns if you have their products. So.
And sometimes it's just good old grunt work from a data analyst. It's overpaid, overpaid work technically for them. But I mean, you literally just send in a data analyst to take a look at it, and they have to figure out what it is over time. It's like direct detective work for them, right? But it's not the most glamorous part, but that's technically within their capability set to go do, right? You'd hate to pay that person that much money to go and do that, but if it's necessary and it's needed, you go and do it, right?
But to your point, Igor's point, you have all these transformations, and like, what the heck are they doing? And I was looking at a clustering algorithm yesterday, and it's in C++, and I was just like, oh my God, because it's all this, and they're taking like 3 things out of this embedding, and they're taking the P25 and the P50 and the P75, and they're slamming them together, and then they're doing a PCA on it, and they're doing it in a sorted array, and it's too big, and it's just like, oh my God, it's so complicated. Well, and yeah, I mean, it's the base. It's I don't think there's an easy answer.